Okay.
Great. So with that, Dr. Abdul, thank you so much for joining us. Again, we've had the pleasure of seeing you on TV and following your race for governor a few years back, and you've always done a great job of, again, representing the Muslim community. And really, we wanted to have you on today because you bring such a unique perspective to the discussion around COVID-19, having been in the public health field. And what are you seeing on the ground right now in terms of all the discussions that are happening about resuming the economy and about potentially ending social distancing? I think we're hearing certain things from medical experts, and then we're hearing political pundits say something almost exactly contradictory. So what is your thoughts on everything that's been happening?
Yeah, first of all, Jazakumullah khair for hosting me tonight. Really excited to be with you. And to the folks in Oklahoma, I'm sorry that I couldn't be with you earlier or at least last month. But inshallah, we hope that we'll be able to be together later on, and certainly for the sisters and brothers in Washington and California, or excuse me, in Florida. Yeah, this is the $64,000 question. What do we do in the context of getting out of social distancing? Because of course this is not the best, and it's not enjoyable, and it's really hurting the economy. At the same time, I just want to make clear why we're doing it and why we need to continue to do it until, of course, our public officials tell us that we can go back to, or at least start resuming different facets of daily life. Is that as I think about a pandemic as a fire, right? Imagine you see the toast in your toaster starting to smoke, and then all of a sudden one of them catches flame, right? You want to put it out immediately. And if you can't put it out when it's a toaster fire, it might engulf the house. And if you can't put it out in the house, it might take on the neighborhood. Right now, we're in a 4-alarm neighborhood-wide fire. And what we had to do to stop the spread after it became a large fire was go into this mass social distancing. Had we been able to react fast enough, right, and we had what we needed to do this, you could have imagined a circumstance where we were able to take on this fire when it was still in the toaster. What would that have taken? It would have required us to be able to do what's called contact tracing. Contact tracing is the key workhorse of public health. You identify every single person who is exposed to the disease, and then you isolate them, and you want to test them to know whether or not they actually got it or they didn't. And if they test negative, then you can let them back into society, and you don't have to worry about contact tracing all of their contacts. We didn't have the testing that we needed. That goes back to failures on the part of the CDC and the federal government generally. And because of that, we weren't able to contact trace when it was still a small burden of cases, when it was still a toaster fire, so to speak. And then we got to the point where it was a mass inferno. And so in order to be able to stop it, then we needed to put up as many barriers to the spread of disease as possible, because the big risk with COVID-19 was that the number of cases was going to overwhelm our healthcare system. And if it did that, we'd be in a scenario where people would literally have to choose who lives and who dies in a hospital setting. Alhamdulillah, gratefully, we didn't get to the kind of peak that it could have been. People are estimating as high as 2.2 million people dying. But it's still a really traumatic peak. People are dying every day, new people getting sick every day. But it looks like we're starting to get to the peak. At this point, we can now have a conversation about saying, okay, well, we did this work of social distancing. We threw up as many barriers as possible to spreading the disease. All of us went in our homes. We minimized the amount of contact that we'd have day to day. What comes next? Well, we're not out of the woods when it comes to contact tracing, because the next step literally relies on our ability to trace every single case of COVID-19, identify the people who are exposed, test them, and if they were testing positive, or before we have a test, make sure that they go into social isolation, trace every single person they came in contact to, and so on and so forth. And that is really the next step of this. So what are we looking for? Number one, we're looking for a steady decline in the number of cases below the burden which we can contact trace to based on the personnel and the tests that we have. Two, we're looking to ask what aspects and facets of social interaction can we do safely, and how do we make sure that they're safe? Three, do we have the hospital capacity, the PPE that we need necessary to make sure that if there's another resurgence, that we're ready for it. And then four, how do we do this in a way that is consistent with where our neighbors and regional economies are engaging in? And so those are really the big questions that I'm looking for. You saw a plan out of the White House. You've seen, governors putting together a set of pacts to think about these things regionally. All of this, though, is going to be, can you see a decline in cases that is consistent? Can you bring the cases down below a level where you can contact trace every single case? Do you have the testing and the personnel available to be able to contact trace at scale? And what aspects of social interaction are we willing to engage with as we come out of socially distancing and re-engaging the economy and daily life?
So looking at this from a civil rights and advocacy perspective, I know a lot of us have concerns around contact tracing, especially when you have either large corporations like Google and Apple who are going to be doing it, or even worse, potentially the federal government doing it. What are those contacts? What is that information going to be shared with? And especially coming from a community that has been heavily surveilled since 9/11. That's something that's top of mind to many of the activists on the ground. What are your thoughts on the discussions that are occurring right now about contact tracing?
Yeah, so that is a really, really astute question, and I think coming from the Muslim community, particularly a conversation with CAIR, there's a real hesitation to any system that would allow for the over collection of data or the long-term storage of data, because of course, in our country we have a long history of both claiming to protect people's civil liberties and then oftentimes failing to protect people's civil liberties. And so this has to be done with an appropriate balance. Here's my take. I think, number one, public health does sometimes, especially when you're talking about an infectious disease epidemic, come at the cost of some civil liberties. Obviously, social distancing, you think about the pretty extensive powers that governors take on in a moment of emergency like this to tell us all to stay in our homes, potentially to fine us for engaging in behavior that would be perfectly legal and perfectly within our rights in any other time, but that's entirely to protect the public's health. So in principle, right, I'm comfortable with the need and the responsibility to contact trace so that we can resume our daily lives, which is really a relinquishing of civil liberties in other ways. And so, it's kind of going from mass social distancing to precision social distancing. But in order to go from mass social distancing to precision social distancing, the trade-off is how many people's civil liberties do you give back, right, to take a deeper level of civil liberties from certain folks, because you're like literally isolating people who have been exposed and, needing to collect data about who they've come in contact with. The thing that I would like to see is that none of this is done. None of this data is stored longer than necessary, that this data ideally is collected at the most local level possible, rather than aggregating up to the federal government, where it has a higher probability of being misused for other reasons, and that the minimal possible data is collected such that the maximal possible public health impact can be engaged with, but nothing more, right? There's a lot of conversation about, enabling Bluetooth tracking and some of these other technologies. And I have some real trouble with that because I just don't think it's necessary. I think this can be done, quote unquote, the old fashioned way and done well. And B, I actually think that the locus of the greatest danger in terms of data collection now doesn't actually happen from the federal government, right? There are a lot of folks afraid of telling the federal government, giving them information on a census. Like, if you've ever been on the internet, you're giving way more information in real time, all the time, by just being on the internet than you would ever give to the Census Bureau. And so I actually think that the biggest danger is really the data that we relinquish to major corporations and what they might do with it. Because, in some respects, I don't have a right to ask a major corporation what it's going to do. It's another private entity, in the same way that I do claim rights upon my government because I am a citizen with rights that are protected. And so in that respect, I do have a lot of issues with enabling some of these background tracking technologies because they're really hard to watch and really hard to keep accountable.
Tanya and Adam, I'd love to bring you all in on the discussion. I know, Tanya, you're a recovering lawyer like myself, and when you hear contact tracing and all of the issues that Dr. Abdul brought up with it, but also the necessity that we're probably going to be facing in the next couple of weeks and months, what are your immediate thoughts?
You said some key things such as, what's the least restrictive means, what's a small amount of time that we can keep data. And if we had a government that was transparent and that was candid about keeping certain things, and we knew that the Constitution was working the way it's supposed to, then, I think all those things you said are correct, right? There's a balance of public safety that we always take into account when we talk about our civil liberties. But, what's alarming about this is the fact that we don't know how the data is going to be used. When you talk about, do you do this the old-fashioned way? Well, that certainly makes us feel a little bit better, but then you bring into this the issues that the Muslim community faces. And a lot of the questions that we hear from like FBI and our clients, right, are, who do you know? And so this issue goes straight to the heart of the civil liberties issues that the Muslim community, as long as I've been working with, is facing. The government wants to know who you're connected with, and how do we secure that data from getting into the hands of the FBI? Maybe it's fine in the hands of the health department, but how do we know that they're not sharing that data or that it is destroyed when we have a system that's currently broken? And so I guess those are the first things that come to mind. And I completely agree with you that we need to do this in a certain way, because otherwise will life resume the way it's supposed to from a medical perspective if we can't start narrowing what social distance looks like.
And Adam and Dr. Abdul, if we had a functioning Congress where we could pass regulation around this in a timely manner, I think that might have alleviated some of the concerns for communities, but we know that that's not a reality that we've faced for a while now. What are your thoughts on potential regulations that government can come down with to maybe at least ease some of the concerns around this issue?
I mean, I agree with everything that Tanya said. At the end of the day, it's about protecting people's civil liberties while also protecting public health. And, we are no strangers to abuses of these civil liberties from government organizations. And I hate to say it, but it's a reality we deal with, whether it's the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, ICE. We have seen it left and right. So yes, we do want to find a way to move past COVID-19, and contact tracing does seem to be a good way to be able to trace it and figure out where it's originating from and how it can be kind of controlled. But at the same time, minority communities, not just Muslims, a lot of minority communities have to know they can trust their government while going about this process. So I think there needs to be some reassurance from the government. And quite honestly, especially on a national level, our government has not really been very reassuring over the last 3 years, if not even longer, for a lot of minority communities.
Yeah, and I just think it's so frustrating, right? Because you look at who is suffering this disease the worst. It tends to be low-income folks, disproportionately Black folks, and then who is liable to have their data breached and or misused? The same communities. And so we've got this situation where in so many ways the government has made us or created a level of vulnerability in our communities that we are seeing exploited by this virus. And this is yet another way, right? When government breaks the trust of its residents by exploiting the data that it collects on them, then it makes them less likely to want to give that data up, and that makes us all less healthy in the setting of a pandemic, where the only choice we have outside of a continuing to socially distance and or having a vaccine, which we're not going to have for a while, is contact tracing. Like, it's the only choice. I host a podcast called America Dissected, and we did an episode today called Testing 1 2 3. Why we're not out of the woods when it comes to testing, because you either prevent this on the upswing, or you lock it down on the downswing. This is where we are now. We didn't prevent it on the upswing, and now we have to lock it down on the downswing. And the only way we do that is by contact tracing or maintaining socially distancing. But think about all of the folks who are so vulnerable economically in this moment to what we're doing with social distancing, that this is unsustainable. And so the question becomes like, what do we do? And it forces really hard, really problematic choices. I do think that there are a couple things that could be done to, I think, reassure communities by creating a legal backstop so that community organizations, folks like you, have a requisite to be able to say, look, this is what proper handling of public health data looks like, and who gets access to it, when they get access to it, why they get access to it. These are the kinds of backstops that can help hold, what we've seen to be an overzealous, particularly immigrant enforcement system, but overzealous law enforcement generally, leveraging data in any way they get. And so it is concerning, and you're right to raise the concern.
And you kind of hit 2 points that I quickly want to follow up with you on. One is just the government trust, and oftentimes many minority communities, impacted communities, feeling that that trust has been broken. One thing I've heard a lot from our community members is there's so much mixed messaging coming out, even about resuming the economy, where you have clusters of governors saying that they're going to align with one another, and then you have the president going out and encouraging folks to essentially protest social distancing. It seems like, again, the interest of individuals is not being placed at the onset of this issue. And given how we're so connected domestically, how do we make sure that if one state decides to start resuming activity before we get to the levels of testing that we need, that it doesn't impact the rest of us?
Can't. I wish I could give you a different answer. I wish our president wasn't who he is. But we're in a circumstance right now where the president of the United States has shown a willingness to put his interest in a 2 to 3 day news cycle over just about anything else. And that's particularly problematic when you're either trying to prevent or respond to a global pandemic. And we've seen that play out in real time. I do know that CAIR is a 501c3 organization, so that is not a political opinion. It is just a statement of fact. But this is the hard part, because what this pandemic has shown us is that we are as vulnerable as the most vulnerable. We are as exposed as the most exposed. And we require collective action to actually take this thing on. And so every time anybody decides to cheat on the social distancing, it makes us all more exposed. It increases the risk that all of us face. And to me, this is the realization, the moment where we come to appreciate that actually we are really in the same boat together, and we don't really have a choice about whether or not we want to take this on together, even though the politics of the moment are threatening our collective action.
And as activists, oftentimes we try to at least emphasize what you can do at a local level, right? Because when it comes to politics, and as you know yourself, oftentimes that's where you have the most influence. And we have the holy month of Ramadan coming up, and I know it's a tradition of ours to congregate and gather, but we've seen great leadership from national leaders, from local leaders, essentially telling people that, look, social distancing is what's going to get us through this. So do you have any advice for Muslim leaders throughout the country who may be in states that, again, they get the green light to resume activity? Should they go ahead and take that leadership upon themselves and their communities to say, look, even if it's okay in the state of Texas to get back to activity, we know it's not in the best interest of our community here, and we want to do our part?
Yeah, I do want to say that this is not an all or nothing thing. Just because the elected officials say that it's okay to resume activity doesn't mean that it would be safe necessarily to do so. I will say that the opposite doesn't apply. So if public officials tell you that it is not safe, trust them, it is not safe. But if they tell you that it is safe, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the safest thing to do. And so my sense is that we have a responsibility in our faith to protect human life. And if and when we engage in activity that may put people in harm's way, we have a real responsibility to it. And our ai*imma are leaders in that respect and have the responsibility to it. And so I would just say that, this Ramadan is going to feel and look a lot different than other Ramadans in the past. And that's really hard, I think, to swallow. Ramadan is such a time where we come together and we we reflect on our community and what it means to be a part of something bigger, even as we do our own ibadah every day in the form of fasting and prayer. The beautiful thing about prayer, especially congregational prayer, is something you do alone if together. Everybody is alone in their prayer. It's not like you're talking to the person next to you. But you are with them. You are engaged with them, all oriented to something greater than you. But I hope that Imma will take the time to really think a little bit about the fact that they and the community has never been more important than it is right now. For a lot of people, social distancing means social isolation, and this is hard, and especially facing down the potential of in effect having a community less Ramadan. That's really hard. And so thinking about using modern technology like this, I sometimes reflect, however hard this is, imagine this happened like 30 years ago. And you didn't have the ability to like look people in the face, talk to hundreds of people at the same time, and engage with each other. So let's take advantage of the tools that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us, and make sure that we're really trying to create even an electronic facsimile of what of what Ramadan can be, and engage each other in that process, because we do need each other. We do need our community, and we need that kind of peace and succor that only proximity with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can have in a time as holy as Ramadan. And so, but I do think we have a responsibility to protect the public's health, protect our communities. And I'm not an imam or a scholar, but I am a doctor and an epidemiologist. And I do think that my professional opinion in this respect is that we should take great care to make sure that if we are engaging in congregational activities, that we are taking every precaution to make sure that they're not dangerous for folks, and especially considering the underlying risk in a lot of our communities. It would be a terrible outcome to re-engage too early, and have community members get sick and have an outbreak in a masjid, and loss of life in our community. We don't want that. That's a never event, and we need to take extra care to make sure that that doesn't happen.
And so the last question I have for the whole panel, but also for everyone who's listening, do you all have any creative ideas that you're going to be engaging with your community or with your family this Ramadan? I know we've started to think about it in my family and how we can carve out time at home to potentially watch some lectures online and make sure that we're doing Tarawih at our home. But I'm curious to hear what you all have in mind. And for those who are listening, feel free to type away what you're doing with your family and your community in the chat box.
Very good. In Oklahoma, it's a challenging thing for us because, we have about 4 or 5 events, just CAIR Oklahoma alone, not to mention all the other community events. And that really, it kind of hurts to not be able to do that. I mean, we had actually planned to host Dr. Abdul on March 28th for our 14th annual CAIR Oklahoma banquet, and we had to postpone that. Inshallah, we hope to have it later this year. And now we're not going to be able to have any Ramadan events, and I think people are feeling that. I mean, we've had iftars, growing number of attendees for iftars over the last 5-6 years, and we've done this iftar with elected officials, and it's just grown to be like this huge celebration because year over year we've accomplished being able to bring like more and more elected officials. I think last year we had 36 for the first time ever. We had the mayor of Oklahoma City. We had Congresswoman Kendra Horn, people that never came to Muslim events before in the history of our state come to be with Muslims. And we had like 36 elected officials. It was like a huge celebration. And so not being able to have those moments is going to be hard. We were actually also supposed to celebrate our 10th annual Ramadan Community Day of Service with the Regional Food Bank of Oklahoma this year. So not having these things hurts. But I think like Dr. Abdul said, taking advantage of technology, we hope to still be able to connect with people in this manner, number one. Number two, I think families need to take an extra step. My wife and I, just before I hopped on this webinar, we ordered some Ramadan decorations, so we could decorate the house. And we typically don't do that because you're going to the masjid, you're going to outside to iftars. But since we're going to be home every day, at least those can be in front of our face to kind of have that celebratory mood amongst our own family. And last but not least, I encourage people, take advantage of all of the beautiful Facebook events and Zoom events and stuff. Imam Sohaib Webb, Sheikh Omar Suleiman, and so many others are going to be nightly on on Facebook or on other platforms, listen to them. It's free of charge, and take advantage of those reminders so that we can, inshallah, boost our iman, our faith. And last but not least, I'll add this. I was talking to my mother the other day, and we came to the conclusion that none of us really have an excuse this Ramadan, because for the most part, with exception, like people working in the medical field and such that are still working as hard as ever, if not harder, what excuse do most of us have where we're now working remotely, and we're not working as many hours, to not pick up a copy of the Quran, right? And to read it every day? What excuse do we have to not make some additional prayers? So this is really, I think, a test for us on the flip side. How much are we going to take advantage of this extra time we have in front of us when we're not going to and from the office, we're not sitting in classes at the university, to actually dedicate our time to more worship during this month?
I think you said that beautifully, Adam. When we talk about opportunity, right? And I'm just going to acknowledge for a minute, when we talk about opportunities and sacrifice of Ramadan, this community has always been amazing, and one of the most creative communities I have ever worked with in my life. And I know when we use the word opportunity, people are they're struggling. Some don't have income. But perspective is going to be so important to our mental health. And I don't know if you can touch on that at all, Dr. Abdul, but we talk about perspective and the idea of Ramadan and sacrifice. You can learn, you can celebrate at home, you can really connect. For CAIR Florida, we're trying to host as many events to connect with the community, to still make sure we're educating those that are from outside the community about how beautiful the religion is, the community is. And so you can be creative now. You can take advantage of so many of these things that we really, like you said, Adam, don't have time. We don't have time on a regular basis to really sit down and think through why we do what we do. And this is a great time to reflect, to learn, and to be together. So I think, again, from CAIR Florida's perspective, I think I'm talking more to my team and each individual person within the CAIR Florida family more than I would if I was in the office with them, right? Because they are intentionally reaching out. We're intentionally having FaceTime, and that's true for a lot of the community members. Ramadan's a great time to reflect, to be together in community, and I think this gives us an opportunity to define what being together means. Aren't we together right now on this call? Aren't we talking about the importance of faith and in the most trying of times? So I think this is hard, it's difficult, it's a challenge, and it's also a great opportunity to do things that we normally wouldn't do.
All right, so I want to kick it over to Adam to really lead the next part of the discussion. But before we do that, I want to reiterate something that Dr. Abdul said. CAIR is a 501c3 organization. When we're talking about elections and candidates, we don't support any. We might talk about the Muslim community as a whole being more pro a certain candidate, but that has nothing to do with where our institution has an opinion on a candidate or not. Again, we are a nonpartisan institution. So Adam, take it away.
Absolutely, thank you. Dr. Abdul, we know that you have been a big and strong supporter of Senator Bernie Sanders and his presidential campaign. I believe you acted as a surrogate for Bernie. And I was actually having a conversation with some young professionals live on Facebook last night, and it was really hard for them. And I think it's hard for a lot of young people, especially in the minority communities, because, for lack of a better term, they were feeling the burn, right? That was their candidate. That was their hope in the future of our country. And now that he has dropped out of the race, I really feel like a lot of people are struggling with the idea of accepting Vice President Biden as the Democratic nominee. But then on the flip side, for communities that have been attacked by Trump, and for communities that feel like, or for you just Americans in general who feel like Trump has not been the leader that he should have been, especially through this COVID crisis, it's kind of like this thing like where I don't know what to do. And the young professionals on this chat last night were even saying, I don't even know if I want to vote. And I think I talked them out of that perspective, because I don't think that's a good thing at all.
Thank you.
But what is your perspective on the 2020 elections and how we should approach them as a minority community here in America?
Yeah, let me say three things. Number one, our vote should be non-negotiable. That we show up to vote should be non-negotiable, because independent of who the candidates are, we have a responsibility to raise our voices, to engage with each other around this, and to make sure that our voice is heard. We don't have a choice otherwise. We have seen what the consequences of bad politics and bad policy has been on our communities. And it's not just civil liberties issues, but it's also things as simple as healthcare, and whether or not you can afford to put a decent meal on the table for your family. These are Muslim issues too. And even beyond that, we have a responsibility to protect our neighbors. And so when we see our neighbors challenged, we have a responsibility to step up, right? Racism is a Muslim issue. Sexism is a Muslim issue. Xenophobia, Muslim issue, even if we're not on the wrong end of those terrible aspects of society. So vote, no matter what happens, vote. Two, I mean, it's heartbreaking. I put my heart and soul for a long time into fighting the good fight. The thing about Bernie that I think spoke so clearly to so many of us is that man has integrity, and that kind of integrity you don't see very often in politics. And when you have a good person stepping up, it's hard to watch that person not succeed, especially when he spoke so clearly to so many of the challenges that our community felt like we were gaslighted into feeling like nobody else saw, and we saw them play out every day. And here comes this figure in politics saying all the things that you've been thinking without hesitation. And so, I'm really grateful to Senator Sanders for running. I'm thankful that he stood with me when I ran. I'm thankful to have gotten to know him and to work with him. In fact, right as soon as we're done here, I'm going to jump on a live stream with him. So, really grateful for that. At the same time, though, sometimes, and I played sports growing up, so I hope that you'll forgive my crude sports analogy here. But sometimes you play on offense, right? And you're shooting to score. Sometimes you got to play on defense. And I think with for a lot of the community, we were playing on offense, saying, look, we have an opportunity to elect Bernie Sanders president, and that's an amazing opportunity because of all the things I just said.
Right.
And right now, we have an opportunity to prevent Donald Trump from being elected. These are my opinions, not CAIR's opinions, but these are my opinions, and I think we have an opportunity to prevent the re-election of somebody who has done manifest damage to all of the things we believe in. And it's not just the way he vilified and marginalized Muslim Americans, but it's also the way he has gone about governing our country, cutting taxes for the richest, while cutting services for everyone else, failing to prevent the single greatest pandemic we've seen in over 100 years. The fact that no matter where it is, like the government's just been run incompetently. These are all opportunities we have. And even if it means that we're not fighting for the big win we want, let's fight against the big loss we don't want. And so, it is a matter of our responsibility to raise our voices, to come out and vote. But I also think it's a matter of our responsibilities to stand up and say, look, we didn't get everything we wanted in this election, but let's make sure we don't lose everything we have.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well said. And one thing I always try to remind people is politics is local, and the local impact of or the local implications of who is elected will impact what goes on a national scene. So I had this conversation last night with these young professionals. I told them, look, even if you don't like what you see in the presidential race, there's still a lot that can be done on a local level, because there's going to be general elections in November. And if you elect the right people, in Oklahoma, we've got some amazing races on the Senate and Congress level for people that will serve us or represent us in DC. And that can have a huge positive impact on some of the policies that come out of Washington, DC. So I always try to remind people, think about that as well. Just don't think about the top office in our country, because there's a lot that goes on below that, right below that has an impact on policies. And speaking of which, you ran for office in 2018, and I was really rooting for you, man. I was so excited to hear that. But I have to ask, and I don't know if you can share, but do you have a future where you see yourself running for office again?
Hello, Adam. My goal is to be useful in 2020. I'll always, God willing, be fighting for the things that I believe in, and a more just, equitable, sustainable America where it shouldn't matter how you pray or what you look like, that you can aspire to lead. And if that means that I get to run again, great. And if that means that I don't, fine. So, we'll see. I'm not running in 2020. I'll just say that much. And what happens after that, we'll have to wait and see.
Sounds good. Well, what would you say, and I'll end with this last question before I kick it over to Tanya, but what would you say to your Muslim community, our Muslim community, as far as the importance of running for office? And if people are on the fence about it, or maybe they haven't thought about it, like, what would be your words of encouragement? Because you experienced it. And I mean, maybe you say, do it, or maybe you say, well, it's stressful, I wouldn't recommend it. But what would be your honest feedback on running for office and whether or not people should do it, especially as Muslims in America?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. Number one, it is not the only way to serve, and it is a really important way to serve. Both of those things are true. I sort of think about it as a pregnancy. Like if you're pregnant with it and you feel like you need to do it, right? Like you gotta go through with it. And I just think that there are folks feel called to do different things in their lives, and if this is something you feel called to do it. I would also just say, though, run into it with eyes wide open. There are a lot of folks who are, will jump into politics without a clear plan, or a clear sense of exactly how they want to run and what they want to do. And I would just say that, like, you really owe it to yourself and the people who come around you to really have a great sense of like what you're doing it for. I think sometimes we in our society focus too much on the what, like what is it that you're going to do, and too little on the why. And so whenever I hear folks who want to run for office, the question I ask them is, what do you want to fix? I'm not going to ask you what office you want to hold. That's clear, right? I want to know what you want to do with that office. And so, I do think, in our faith, we are taught to be very humble about leadership. There are a lot of folks who see themselves in a position and say, I want to be in that position. And that's not a good reason to run, to be frank. Yes, we need representation. Yes, we need leaders, but our leaders have to do stuff, not just be stuff. And so it's not enough to just say, I want to represent in that office so I can, hold the office. I want folks who are telling me, look, I want to fight for X, Y, and Z issue. And if I found any other way to do it, I would do it. But it seems like this is the one I need, and I need to fulfill. And that's the reason why you run for office. So I just think there's a real responsibility to be asking the why about what you want to solve, who you want to serve, and why you can't do it in another way. And so, I just think there's a humility that in our faith we have to bring to everything that we do. And an honesty of intentions, because the thing about politics is that it does come with a lot of limelight. It comes with a lot of fame, and there are a lot of folks who really want that. And I just think we have a real responsibility to like call ourselves and hold ourselves accountable to ourselves, right? Hold our nefs accountable to ourselves, and make sure that our intentions are pure and we're doing it for the right reasons. And I think that's really about the why question. Why are you doing this? Why do you want to do this? Who do you want to serve? Rather than what position do you want to occupy? Because it's not a fulfilling way to live your life, first of all. Second of all, we believe that in the end, we're going to be judged on what we do. And we don't want to be in a position where, we've done and been, and, in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because our intentions weren't right, that it counts for nothing.
Dr. Abdul,
beautifully said.
Quick point, and it goes to what you were talking about in terms of why do you want to do this? I had so many people reach out to me in the community devastated that Bernie had dropped out of the race. And what I try to emphasize with them was, why did you love Bernie? Was it because of Medicare for all? Was it because of loan forgiveness? Was it because of a working wage? Was it because he brought humanity to issues like Palestine and Kashmir and so many other international issues? And if those were the reasons that you were supporting him, why aren't you continuing to do that work and continue to fight for those issues with whoever is running?
Right.
Are there particular topics that you think that we as a community, in coalition with other faith communities and minority and impact communities, can continue to advocate for in 2020?
Yeah, look, I think we have a responsibility as a community to find our why. And there are a lot of whys out there, whether it's, ending mass incarceration that systematically devastates low-income Black folks in our country, whether it's fighting to make sure that we offer every single person in this country healthcare, and that you don't have to pay $1,500 to get access to the insurance you already paid for, whether it's the fight to protect our environment and to end the addiction that our economy has on a system of energy production that poisons us. These are all fights that I would love to see the Muslim community leading, because we have a stake in these fights. And sometimes, the challenge we have is that we wonder why so many folks, don't show up for our fights. And increasingly now it's become en vogue for people to show up for our fights. But the big question I want us to be asking is, what of their fights have we shown up for, right? Because at the end of the day, our responsibility wasn't necessarily just to fight for our own identity. Our responsibility is to fight for justice. And that means fighting with everybody who's on the wrong side of injustice. And I want us as a community not to be so insularly focused. We do a great job building leaders for Muslims. I want us to be building leaders for humanity. And that is a real responsibility we have. And it's not about, our identities. It is about justice, because, we are a community where we believe in a holy book that says, "I'dilu huwa aqrabu lit-taqwa." Seek justice. That's the closest thing to seeking consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's got to be our fight. All of these have to be our fights. And we've got to get real good at showing up for them.
Yeah, you said something fantastic I want to go to, and it actually goes to one of our audience questions about getting re-energized. Regardless of who your candidate was, CAIR, as we can't have, we're nonpartisan, but we have issues, right, that are important to the community as a whole. So when we're talking about getting energized, you talked about taking action. You talked about getting informed and understanding the issues you support. So regardless of what candidate you're supporting, if we're not educated on a national level, on a state level, then you're getting energized about a person. This is about a system. This is about getting out and voting and getting involved. What action can you take? And you said it beautifully. Why are you taking that action? Why are you involved in the first place? Why did you support, whether that's Bernie or Warren or, one of the Republican candidates? Why are you doing it? Goes to the issues that we all stand for to fight against injustice. And so when we have individuals talking about, how do I get re-energized? How do we get re-energized about the issues? How do we actually understand the issues enough in our communities federally and locally that we are beyond the political parties and we're talking about the things that matter? So can you speak to that, to answer, our audience question about how do you get re-energized, and why does it really, how can we change? How can we be that system of change?
So I think we have a responsibility to reconnect to two things: who we serve, and why we serve. And I'll just say, I don't know if you remember, back when you were in high school, you would take a science class, and some teacher would lecture you about the way that anatomy of a frog is, and then you would potentially go and dissect the frog. I always found the dissecting the frog part a lot more interesting because it was hands-on, it was real. And in some respects, we allow the issues that we fight for to be so abstract that we forget the tangible reality that people live in. And that's a function of privilege. And, we also have an idea of that in our faith called ghafla, right? The idea that you forget what you're here to do. And I think the more time we spend connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what the purpose of this time, this very, very short time that we have here is, and then connecting to people who truly do suffer the challenges that we want to fight for, I think these things become real. And so I'm just saying, don't take the lecture course without taking the lab course. And I think the lab course is deciding that you're going to go and connect to folks who are living the circumstances that you want to be a part of fixing, recognizing what that looks like, feels like, and then doing the work of spending your time thinking about why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you what he gave you and what you owe it. And I think if you do those things, these fights become a lot more real. And it also forces you to be a lot more pragmatic, right? A lot of folks are like, well, I'm going to Bernie or bust. Like, he wasn't my guy, I didn't win. I'm going to take my ball and go home. And my point is just like, look, I was the health commissioner for the poorest city in America. Every single day, I got to talk to constituents, people who are struggling on the wrong end of poverty and injustice. And I'm not about to go tell them that I'm going to take my ball and go home because my guy didn't win, right? Like, they don't get to do that, right? Their life stays the same. And so if the fight was about their well-being and justice for those folks, then it doesn't end just because your candidate doesn't win. And I think we have to have a real sense of like who we fight for, rather than fighting for these abstracts that can be, tossed for the next abstract, the next good idea, the next good ideology, rather than people who are struggling, right? You serve them to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's it.
Beautiful, beautifully said. You know, I will just say real quick before, I know Tanya has some questions about your newly released book as we get close to the end of this, but real quick, I will say, you know, it made me realize it's like people who believe in the message of, for example, a popular scholar, and when something happens with that individual or they lose touch with that individual, it's like their faith sinks. But our faith is not in the individual who's preaching, it's in the religion itself. Much like, as you said, it's not about the candidate, but it's about what is the end goal, what are the values we're pushing forward. So I really appreciate that. And I think we have to keep the focus on what we're trying to achieve. It was through Bernie we were trying to achieve the end goal. So just because he has dropped out of the race doesn't mean we stop the fight. But Tanya, let's take the last few minutes and talk about Dr. Abdul El-Sayed's new book. Very excited. I got my copy right here, and you can check it out. I know it's on Amazon, but please do check it out.
Absolutely. I'm actually just shared the link for everybody there who's interested. You know, I know that the title of your book, What Perfect Timing. You know, tell us a little bit about, you know, about your book and why it's so just appropriate for the times we're going through.
Yeah. So as you know, I'm an epidemiologist, and my why was always framed by visiting my grandmother in Egypt. My grandmother is the wisest, most intelligent person I've ever met. She never got to go to school, and whenever I'd be in Egypt, she'd always you know, cut me right back down to size. So I was like the, you know, the arrogant cousin from America, and so she'd point to one of my cousins and be like, "That one's smarter than you." Point to another cousin and be like, "That one's taller than you." Point to a third one, be like, "That one's better looking than you." And her point was, there's no difference between you and them. The difference is the opportunities that you have. And those opportunities would always be framed on, like, you know, 15-hour plane rides, where in 15 hours I'd clear 10 years difference in life expectancy. Here's the crazy thing though. I grew up in Metro Detroit. I could drive 25 minutes and drive 10 years difference in life expectancy. And that was my why. I wanted to solve that. And that led me, you know, to become a doctor, and then realize that the health system that I was working in ultimately had more to do with moving money to very rich people than it did to healing folks who did not have money. And then went into epidemiology as a researcher, and then got the opportunity to rebuild the health department in the city of Detroit. And that job was truly fulfilling in a really profound way. But I realized that there was a ceiling that I couldn't broach, and that was the ceiling of the political decisions that politicians made, and that's ultimately why I ran for office. And as an epidemiologist, I thought that, you know, I'd left epidemiology behind when I decided to run for office. But the reality was that I was now meeting all of the people I would have been analyzing as data points. And throughout my 18 months traveling across Michigan, I realized that, you know, there really is an epidemic that we're struggling with, and it's an epidemic of insecurity. And what I mean by that is all of the systems that we rely upon to deliver us the basic means of a dignified life, a healthcare system, an education system, an economic system, a political system, that those have been devastated by a profit margin that has cut our ability to invest in basic public services, be that our public health infrastructure, or, you know, the roads and bridges that we drive on every day, or an economy that is fair and equitable. And then delivered the well-being to the very top. And that's left us fundamentally insecure. And that this epidemic of insecurity has consequences for our politics that self-reinforces. And so in this book, I try and tell my own story. I talk a little bit about what epidemiology is and how it works, and then diagnose this epidemic of insecurity and the kind of empathy politics I think we need to treat it. And it, unfortunately, is extremely relevant now because we're dealing with the consequences of massive disinvestment of our public services, and, you know, the vulnerability of people to a pandemic that itself was preventable.
I mean, again, what a timely read right now, and I look forward to actually reading it. And, you know, since we only have a few minutes, I know you do have to run. I want to kind of ask, you know, in light of the book, in light of everything we've had conversations about, you know, what's your prescription to what do we do next? You know, what do we literally do with the information we have, and how do we filter out the information that, you know, really our broken system is feeding us?
Yeah, the first quote that that you'll see in the book is a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. Verily, I was only sent to insist upon the best of character. And I think character at its core, at its best, is about reflecting the human experience among one another. It's about finding empathy. And I think more than anything else, we have a responsibility to connect to ourselves, to connect to our creator, and to connect to the people around us and in our own communities. And I think that that mutual connection, if you're able to make yourself a conduit between all of those things, you'll center yourself, you'll find yourself. And the work, the responsibility becomes a lot more clear. And so I think that that to me is sort of the most centering thing, is that if you're despairing right now, if you're frustrated right now, if you're angry right now, if you feel disconnected right now, if you feel sad right now, connect to the things that matter most. Connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, connect to other people, and try and be really, really honest with yourself as you make those connections. And I think it becomes so much clearer, both what you can control and what you can't, what your responsibility is to what you can control, and the fact that in the end, all the outcomes are with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I hope that we can find that empathy, and we can find that proximity to the divine. And that, we have Ramadan coming around the pike. It's only a week away. And this is an opportunity for us to purify. And, I think a lot of folks are despairing about the fact, and we talked about this, that, Ramadan's happening in the middle of a pandemic. But Ramadan's happening in the middle of a pandemic. And, there's always opportunity. And so, for me, like, I look at what my Ramadan was going to be. I would have been all over the country, speaking and working on the book and trying to help folks raise money for their nonprofits. And alhamdulillah, there's barakah and good work in that. But like, that means that there's less time to really reflect on my own life, my own responsibility, my family, my own situation. And so there's real benefit in that. And so I just think that, like, we all, in the end, our job is not to control the circumstances. Our job is to control our own behavior within the circumstances. And always, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala presents some silver lining in the cloud, even if it's a little. And so I hope that we have the opportunity to find it.
Beautiful, beautiful. I know we're getting close to the end. Would you like to share, Dr. Abdul, how people can stay in touch with you? I know you got a website, you're on social media. What's the best ways people can follow you and stay up to date with all the amazing things you're doing?
Yep. If you're on Instagram or Twitter, it's at Abdul El-Sayed, no dash in the EL after the EL. And if you're on Facebook, it's just follow our page at Abdul from Michigan. And then our website is abdulelsayed.com. And I hope folks will reach out. You can email me directly. We do answer those emails if you have any questions. And then you can check out the book at healingpoliticsbook.com. Really grateful for the opportunity to spend time with you. Grateful for the work that you all do, fighting for the most marginalized in our communities. And grateful to get to spend an hour with you. And jazakumullah khair. May Allah put barakah in your work. And for all those who joined us tonight, I hope that we've said something meaningful. And if we were wrong in any way, that's on us. And I hope that, inshallah, you'll forgive.
And we hope that once we get through this as a country and as a community, we can have you in Florida, in Oklahoma, in Washington State, so that the community can interact with you in person, inshallah.
Inshallah, my privilege. Barakallahu
Thank you so much for being with us.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.